All right, everybody. We got another very special guest for you all this week. I want everybody to welcome to the show Alisa Kwitney. Welcome, Alisa.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
That was definitely the first try.
Yeah, first try. Nailed it. These are the reasons we don't do a live show on like Twitch or something. We can go back and edit all the good stuff. Alisa, thank you so much for being on the show. Very excited to talk to you about GILT coming out in a week. Yeah, a week from this show. But all our first-time guests have to go through the torture of doing an origin story for us. So give us I know you've written some novels and stuff like that, but where did it all start for comics for you? Where you can.
You want to talk about the important stuff, like
not the important stuff,
piddly little books.
Yeah,
let's talk about the comics. So I was a comics reader from childhood. So I'm ancient enough so that the local candy store, the local stationery store had comics. And, when the new ones came out, you would just buy as many as you could. And I bought them in like descending order of what I wanted. So, first came horror and then, probably Archie's. Sometimes, weirdly enough, I liked romance. And then there were some superhero comics I liked. And then if there were one of those weird short-lived feminist superheroes, they would go straight to the top, even besting the horror for a while.
Okay. Wow.
So anyway, and everyone I knew read comics. It was just what you did in the 70s as a kid. And I guess I didn't stop. My mom never made me throw out all my comics. And after a while, I the comics stopped being sold. And I think finally someone said, yeah, you need to go to a comic book store. And I said, oh, okay, where's the comic book store?
Yeah.
So I started going into comic book stores. And I remember some kid looking at me. I was probably about 17. Like I saw him tug his friend, like, there's a girl.
It's always a rare sighting, right?
I'm also really oblivious. And this was back in the days when I think comic book stores were, not necessarily welcoming. I remember hearing a lot of women talk about memories of feeling excluded. I was just oblivious. I was like, where are your horror comics?
Yeah.
How come you don't have any more Shanna the She-Devil? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
So that was how I started with comics. And I got introduced to the Uncanny X-Men when I was in college. I was an English major, and I would go to this secondhand bookstore to get romance and comics. And so I don't know. I just didn't really stop reading them. But I wasn't really clear on how they were made. And it was many years later, I was finishing Columbia's fiction writing program. And I thought, I'm probably going to need to get a job after this.
Yep, that might be important.
All the normal people were going to the literary, big five publishing houses. And I thought about doing that, but I also thought I'd throw my hat in the ring for romance editing and comics editing. So I sent Silhouette, was in New York City. And so at that time, we're both DC and Marvel. So I sent out my resume and DC got back to me. Marvel ghosted me. And Silhouette got back to me too. They told me I was overqualified.
Wow.
But DC said, no, overqualified's the way we like them.
Yep.
And in a way, I guess I was probably underqualified, but I learned so much at DC. Mm-hmm. After I'd been working at DC for about 6 months, I did get a job offer from Silhouette, but that's it. My die was cast.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you editing there?
7 years on staff. And I left because I really wanted to write, and I'd also hatched some younglings. And so I couldn't handle all three of those things, but I continued to work with DC and with Vertigo. I did Sandman, the King of Dreams, and Vertigo Visions. I did, I also wrote some comics.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's awesome. And I mean, the books that you saw in that timeline where you're editing too, I mean, that's a lot of stuff happening at that time too. So I'm sure that was a great experience.
It was intellectually great,
Yeah.
and it was also just a ton of fun.
Yeah.
I was about to curse, but then I thought, I don't know if
no,
I was
you can
supposed to curse.
curse. No, you can curse on this.
It
That's
was
fine.
Oh yeah.
it was a shit ton of fun.
There you go. Yeah, hell yeah. That's what I want to hear. A shit ton of fun.
So your timeline, were you there when the greatest comic ever written, Doom Patrol number 70, was written?
I think so. You mean the cod piece?
Yeah, the cod pieces.
Yes.
The cod piece. Yes. Yes, I was kind of in the room where it happened because I was sharing an office with Tom Pyre, and we were both smokers at the time, and either by accident or on purpose. I think at that point they'd put us in a room that had been ventilated for like big old-fashioned computers, and instead it was just Tom and me smoking too much.
That's amazing. Here, you're going to be back here with all the really hot computers we have to vent because you need to smoke.
Yeah, I guess there was another room with a lot
Yeah.
of really unhappy computers.
Yeah.
Maybe the computers started to smoke. I don't know.
Who knows? That's amazing. Yeah. And all our listeners know that we always pitch codpiece left and right. So to have somebody that was there at the origin is it's pretty momentous and epic for us. So yeah, I think probably out of the over 250 episodes, I think this is probably our best and most important guest right now. So you get the Oscars are going on right now, but that's our Oscar award to you. So.
If proximity to Tom Pyre and Rachel Pollack, makes me most valuable, I'll take it.
There you go. Although we did talk to Tom last week. Hopefully he doesn't listen to the show. I don't think he does. He might be too cool for us. All right, so let's talk GILT and Ahoy Comics. Chris and I have been huge fans of Ahoy and what they've been doing, the types of stories they've been putting out. We find ourselves like moving away more from the big two of comics because we like stories that have a lot of heart, that are more horrific than normal because I love horror comics. And I know you said you do too. So where does GILT come in all of this? Is this kind of a lot of stuff that you would read is what you're putting into this book, or how did that start?
Yeah, it's let me see if I can find a way inside of every older, perhaps even middle-aged and older comic book reader, there is still, your 7 or 9-year-old self. And yet, you have to find a way to sort of please that taste. But in order to do that, you have to do it in a way that still resonates with who you are now. And wow, that sounded like the weirdest and wordiest way to put that. So yes, I think that for both me and for Morissette, the artist, we have this great love of old House of Mystery, House of Secrets. I've also got here, I go to Mega Brain, John Michel's Rhinebeck store, and he has great vintage. So I've got old.
Yeah, I love the covers. I love the dark green covers and the earth tones of the horror comics. Yeah.
And I used to also love, here's Midnight Tales.
Oh, yeah.
Arachne and what is it? The Midnight Philosopher.
Oh, yeah.
And everything I do when I'm given any free reign shows that influence. When I did Mystic U, there was this big plop creature that was, composed from the effluvia of all the students.
Okay.
And Plop was a short-lived comic from DC that combined humor and horror. It had Cain and Abel, a lot of Sergio Aragonés stuff, some great Bernie Wrightson story about, I think in particular, there was one about frogs' legs that really was formative for me. So with GILT, I wanted to write something that felt like it resonated with the themes and things that I was thinking about now. My one sentence pitch of it was the Golden Girls meet Sex in the City by way of the Twilight Zone.
Sold.
Got me at Golden Girls.
Yeah. And I love Twilight Zone too. So I mean, both of those.
Well, yeah. So there was a lot about my mom still lives in the apartment building on the Upper West Side where I grew up. And there are all these wonderful, quirky old women who live in these apartment buildings, and they've got all these stories and all this stuff. And I just was thinking about time travel and about the characters of the Golden Girls. And at the same time, I wanted it infused with other 70s stuff that I love, a lot of it coming from that sort of philosophical, but slightly sort of, I would call it dark uplift that you get from the kids' horror comics of the 70s and from the Twilight Zone.
Right. Yeah.
I haven't watched as much of Black Mirror as perhaps I should have, because I would keep watching and it was so dark and it didn't have as much of that gross out fun that I sort of relish.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I was just having a conversation the other day about the original Twilight Zone and how it did that. Like, it had the philosophical, like almost like the lesson at the end of it. But like the episode, "The Meek Inherit the Earth," with the Santa Claus who's homeless, but he like gets the magical sack that like gives out gifts to the kids. It has that sense of fun there. But it's like wow, this is pretty sad and depressing, and but there's some philosophy there too, and it's that's one of the greatest things I loved about it. And like you said, Black Mirror is just kind of dark and a lot of weird stuff happening a lot of the times. I think they missed that almost. But yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say, so my father was the science fiction writer Robert Sheckley, and my mom and dad were in the whole science fiction world of Greenwich Village in the 50s. My mom, I do have to say, says that Rod Serling was notorious for stealing the ideas of the writers who pitched to the show. Wow. So whenever people are like, yeah, and he wrote so many of the best episodes, I think, well, not according to my mother.
Okay, well, you have to listen to her, right? So I believe her too. Is it safe to say that Hildy Winters, the main character, right, is kind of a your mother cast in the book, or?
Oh yeah, there's so much of my mother in Hildy. Hildy is kind of a combination of my mom and B. Arthur.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So where does the time travel come into it? Is that something you've always wanted to play with? Writing is time travel, or?
I love to play with things where you can deal with real themes in either a science fictional or fantasy way, and everything feels emotionally grounded. So I come at things from different directions. So because my mom stayed with me during the pandemic, I ended up watching The Golden Girls. In the 80s, I wasn't watching The Golden Girls. It was in the background. And I think because of the reboot of Sex and the City, more people have been talking about this. But okay, so first of all, the Golden Girls were much younger than I had recalled. They were in their 50s and 60s in the show, not 70s and 80s. They were having a ton of sex and, active fun.
Yep.
And then when the series ends, spoiler alert, the main character, who's kind of the linchpin, goes and gets married, leaving her best friends and her mother, which is beyond weird.
Right.
And I had this epiphany. So first of all, the epiphany was nobody wants sitcoms to end by ending. Nobody wants MASH, even though it's nice, I guess, that Hawkeye gets to go home. We didn't want that. We want them to stay forever doing the things they're doing. We didn't want Cheers to end. But I thought in particular, there was something about leaving your friends for a marriage. And then I thought about Sex and the City. And even before the whole reboot and the brouhaha, I was thinking, Mr. Big was just bad news, clearly bad news. The answer was not, oh, look, he's finally come around and you're going to marry him. You're like, no, that's got to be a mistake. And so I thought about, what if the character of Hildy regrets this marriage? And now, okay, this is going to come at this from a very different side. The other, I have these different obsessions and they all kind of coalesced. It makes me sound a little crazy, but I am. Okay, so
perfect for the podcast.
In New York, there's two. I think they're websites, and they've put out books. One's called Ephemeral New York, and the other is called forgotten New York. And they both deal with little known tidbits about architecture and things that happened in the city and what you can still recognize. And I started to dig around for an interesting Upper West Side building because, so much has been done with the Dakota and knockoffs of the Dakota where people were doing their riffs on Rosemary's Baby. So I knew I wanted a building like this old pre-war I'd grown up in where there would be a time portal when you went out the back door, the fire door. But I wanted to find a building that would sort of justify this that nobody knew about. And I found it, and I got to visit it before the pandemic hit and everything closed down. It's called the Level Club, and people should totally look this up. It was made by Theosophists according to the blueprint of King Solomon's Temple.
Wow.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, I have pictures up of it right now. Wow.
And then it became like some kind of swanky, like swinging club in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
So I kind of began to imagine this as a cross between, I called it the Bellicent. I don't even remember how I came up with the name, but I thought of it as a cross between the occult Dakota and, Plato's Retreat and like this building where incredible stuff happened, but nobody really knows about it.
Yeah, you wouldn't know it walking into the building or seeing, you go inside, you're like, oh, something's going on here, but you could never tell from the outside, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Except there would be these little funny signs and gargoyles and things. But yeah, right before the pandemic, I actually walked by the building and went inside and said to the doorman, I'm writing a comic and I'd like to use this building. Can I take pictures of the lobby? And he said, sure. And then this woman walked by with a stroller and I said, hey, I'm doing a comic about this building. And she said, do you want to look at my apartment? So I
wow.
did. I didn't end up really using her apartment, but it was, little did I know it was the end of this age of innocence before everyone would be wearing masks and frightened to even breathe in the same, lobby as somebody else.
Wow. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Be in the same room as someone. It's pretty amazing.
Is there like some sort of like dark magic, occult stuff going on in the background that causes the time travel or something? Or how does that kind of tie into this building and everything?
Well, I just figured this building was made by occultists and theosophists according to the blueprint of King Solomon's Temple, and that would lead to, some time travel stuff going on.
Okay.
But of course, there are co-op rules. And what happens when you break them. So the Guild of Independent Lady Temporalists, it has its rules. One, only the owner of the apartment can time travel. You can't go through with anyone else. And there are other rules involved and some sort of safeguards. So the way I have done the time travel for ease is when you go out the back door, you go 40 years into the past. And you are then wherever your body was at 40 years in the past. So if you weren't there, we won't even talk about that. But so you have to wait for your opportunity. And then time passes at the same pace. But the longer you spend in the past, the more you become like the self you were. So if you want to go back to when you were 9 years old and you're thinking, I'm going to do it differently because I have, these better I have more perspective. I can do it all differently. No more will people laugh at me because I ate a sardine sandwich. True story.
Oh, okay. That's very specific. Yeah.
Mustard sardine sandwich. It's something I do blame my mother for, but we won't. Okay. So, but then you go into the past, and the longer you spend in your 9-year-old body in the past, the more you become, who you were. And affected by the way people thought of things then. You think that you'll bring your the present tense of the book is 2013 and it goes back to 1973, but you can't hold on to that for very long. Except that Hildy goes back with Trista. So Hildy goes back with her new home healthcare aide, who is kind of the Bill Murray school of employees where she's doing the bare minimum. and she's incredibly cynical, and she goes back in time with Hildy. And it turns out that they hadn't realized, but they had met each other on that day in 1973, and their lives were entwined in ways they didn't know. But they've gone through the portal together. They've screwed up time, and that leads to all kinds of shenanigans.
Sold. That's what I need. The shenanigans. I need to find out what the shenanigans are. And another thing about the book, the art is amazing. Just some of the characters you can see on the covers for 1 through 3 that they've shown. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'll hold up.
Yeah,
the cover.
That's a great cover.
This is Alain's cover. We also have a variant cover by Jill Thompson. So, and you can see just in the cover the whole House of Mystery influence. So I'll try to find it. Oh, there's just so many great things here that Alain has done.
Yeah. Those are great cats too.
Okay, so I'll talk for a minute about Hildy's cats.
And yes,
that will help me talk about Alain's and my process. So, I just had someone ask me, so is it that one of those things where you guys totally plot together, or is it like you go off and you write the script for him and then he just does it? And I said, it's like both and neither, because we talk and then I'll go off and write with him very much in mind, but we're constantly having a dialogue about things. So I did a little throwaway with the cats, and he just began to include them as kind of straight men having all of these reactions. And so when I went back to the lettering script, I began to tweak things. And then I began to think, okay, wait a minute, I have to figure out more about these cats. And it's like that with a lot of the stuff that we do. I think I don't, sometimes your subconscious knows things are important. Like I started with the doorman at the building, and as the story progressed, I realized, oh, this is a magical building and the doorman is not just a doorman. Right. And as Alain and I talk, we'll throw things back and forth with each other, and he'll show me stuff all the time. And so as he's drawing, it affects how I'm writing. And we just, so it's, I don't know. It's really, I haven't had quite this experience before. And in part it's because Alain and I have been trying to work together for 7 years.
Wow. Okay. So it finally happened. That's great. Yeah. And then before we wrap up here, you're going through Ahoy for this. So can you talk a little bit about how did that come about, like working with Ahoy Comics in general?
Well, obviously I know Tom Peyer and Stuart Moore from, when we were all working at Vertigo together and going to the Irish pub to drink. But I love the sensibility, and I knew, right from the start that what Tom was talking about was Vertigo in terms of the humor, in terms of the intelligence, and not delivering the expected thing in the expected way, but really infused with humor. And I think people underestimate the difficulty of writing humor and the strength and the power of what humor can do, which is probably the least funny thing that a person could say. But I actually think about humor all the time, and how do you get what is funny? Because I also have all these theories that funny is the opposite of clever. Those little clever, I was writing in the chicklet craze of the 90s, and I knew that there were a lot of joke-shaped objects that were, funny-esque. But in order to be truly funny, something has to really teeter on the edge of tragic or disgusting, discomforting. And I knew that Tom would allow me to do all of that stuff.
Right. Yeah. So you've kind of had the free reign to tell the story the way you want to.
Yes. Yeah. And he, he gave me such great advice. At one point I was getting bogged down with time travel. And Tom just said, whenever you have a time travel question, go with what feels the most fun. And it was great advice.
Yeah, I've been a huge fan of like stand-up comedy for most of my life. And I always, when you listen to comedians talk about it and they'll say like the difference between something that's like pretty much, to put it bluntly, something that's offensive and then something that's funny is just crafting the words properly to make it funny, or finding a way to subvert the offensive to bring it back to funny. Like there's just a fine line sometimes with those things. So I understand completely what you mean by all that. And it's a different medium being written as opposed to like a stand-up. So it's even harder because you can't really test it on an audience.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll say something. Can I say something technical if this is...
Yeah.
I was, when I listen to these things, I love when people talk about the technical things. So there was one scene where I had tweaked dialogue because I realized I had to acknowledge something that was in the art. And it was too wordy. It was the one place where Tom, I think, had changed the wording a little. I said, oh, I'm not sure about this. And Tom said, oh, you caught, because I'm not one of those writers who can remember. And it was, written a couple of months prior. And I said, okay, let me look at this again. And I kept Tom's wording because I couldn't think of anything better than what he'd done. But I completely rearranged the balloons because I realized in order to get the joke, you need to just break it up so the pacing is different. And, and it's, it's funny. I do love working collaboratively too. I think that, I've done improv and I prefer it to stand up. I just like riffing and getting the feedback from other people and playing with them.
Yeah. And I'm sure that probably helps too with the collaboration process of the comics, doing the improv, right?
I think it does. Although, at this point, saying that you've done improv is like saying you've been in a band. Everyone has.
Saying you have a podcast.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, especially what about comics? No, for sure. But Alisa, I'm so excited for this book. It comes out in a week, April 6th. Go to your local comic shops. Thank you so much for being here. And if we want, our listeners, our watchers to follow you and what you're doing on your social media, where can we send them?
Oh, I'm on Twitter at a Kwitney. I think I'm k.witty on Instagram, but I haven't been. I need to start Instagramming more. And I've got a website, which is, www.alisakwitney.com. And of course, I have a podcast, which is about the Sandman, and that's Endless, a Sandman podcast. And
I'm going to check that out.
Thank you.
I love when people plug their podcasts there. I'm going to check it out for sure. Awesome.
Is that the Sandman podcast? Is that like behind the scenes stuff? Are you going through the book and reading it, or what is that one about?
Oh yeah, so my friend and story expert Lani Diane Rich and I'm rereading Sandman. She's reading it for the first time, and we're talking about it in terms of her reaction to the story and the art, and learning about comics, and me. Remembering whatever I can remember with my dull and dimming memories. And then when the Netflix series comes out, we're going to switch to that.
Oh, very cool. Yeah,
very
that's
cool.
Awesome. I'm checking that out. Yeah.
So everybody out there, remember I will have the links down below so you can follow Alisa's stuff even further. And thank you so much for being on the show. We always appreciate someone taking their time to come and talk to us. So
yeah, thanks, Alisa.
Alisa.
Thank you. I'll answer to anything. Just call me Kwitney.